I mean, we all know that she headed the healthcare task force, and that was at her insistence. There were other wiser heads who said the first policy you should tackle is welfare. Bill Clinton knows a lot about welfare. It could be a bipartisan victory. It could get you off on the right foot, but Hillary really wanted to do healthcare policy, and so he owed her, and she demanded a seat at the table. I was just struck by how pervasive her role was throughout those 8 years, even after, in a public way, she receded from the dominating force.
The public role changed a lot. The private role didn't really.
As one of her advisors said, she was, she was intellectually a little bit chastened by having lost the healthcare battle.
And the midterms,
which led directly to the Democrats losing both houses of Congress.
And the midterms actually, that brought Gore a little more into the picture.
A little more into the forefront, but she was still very active behind the scenes, serving as a kind of a back channel for people inside and outside the government who wanted to have access.
I loved what Mac McClarty said when he was being moved out of his job. He said, to be the chief of staff there, you have to speak Machiavellian in the original Italian.
Right. He also called himself a javelin catcher.
Right. But this really went. But this really went most particularly to Hillary and the relationship between Hillary and Bill.
Yes, it did.
When people made those comments, that's what they were talking about.
Because the tensions of their marriage, which were considerable in those days.
Played out in front of the staff.
They played out in front of the staff, and they spilled over into decision making, and a lot of people had a hard time dealing with it. I remember one person said she knew how to push his buttons, and if she were angry with something, she would give him permission to get angry. I mean, George Stephanopoulos categorized 6 different kinds of temper tantrums that Bill Clinton would have. and one other person said, there's a saying in the White House, when Mama's not happy, nobody's happy, and you could read her weather forecast on his face.
Well, yeah. Well, that does come across. Now, something you say is that that you believe that there's been sort of a collective national amnesia about Clinton that derived largely from the events of 9/11 and the war. Your book certainly, blows that amnesia away. But do you think that for the country, as the election goes forward, that the country's going to come out of this amnesia, and what would the ramifications of that be?
Well, I think really, first of all, Hillary is running, at least in part, on her record as First Lady, and is saying that those 8 years in the White House give her an edge over everybody else because she had that experience. Yet at the same time, she's being very selective in terms of what she wants to highlight from that time. And it's kind of, she's sort of a virtual incumbent. And it's kind of it's an unusual circumstance that we actually have this record of how the two of them made decisions, what the quality of those decisions was, how they what their judgments were, how they responded to all the pressures in the White House, where every decision had consequences and the stress level was high every day. I mean, there are people who say, well, you should judge her on her conduct in the Senate. And yes, she has learned some important things, but to really understand how the two of them operate, you have to look at them in tandem in that period. And I think as time goes on, we're going to need to just take a closer look at, you can't, they want the past sort of dimly and nostalgically recalled.
Yeah, shot with Vaseline over the lens.
As opposed to truly told. And that was one of the purposes of my book, was to do it in a very even-handed way, in a very sort of unflinching way, in a very clear-eyed way.
Now, you did talk to lots of people, and obviously, as a biographer, I don't need to tell you this, time always serves you. And I'm wondering, as you talk to people who knew them, how it broke down between people who were like, I'm ready now to talk, I'm ready now to spill what I know.
Well, with the Kennedys, it was much easier because
more
it was
time.
40 years on.
Right.
And there were people who had been kind of keeping secrets their whole lives who decided, well, you know, I don't have much more time on this earth, and I guess if I'm going to talk, I might as well talk now. And I just happened to walk in the door at the right time. But this circumstance, I mean, presidents and first ladies leave office and they shut the door. And Bill and Hillary left 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue with the door wide open. Their friend Linda Bloodworth Thomason spent, you know, one of the last nights there. And when she walked out of the Lincoln bedroom that morning, she put a little note on the pillow and it said, "I'll be back."
Wouldn't you like to know what happened? Wouldn't you like to know what happened to that note?
Yeah. So I remember it was funny when Hillary was elected to the Senate. Dan Rather asked Bill Clinton, you know, the next day, well, is she going to run in 2004 or 2008? And Bill said, "That's just idle speculation. How dare you say something like that?" And then somebody else asked Pat Moynihan, and he said, "Of course she's running." You know, so they, you know, and in fact, you know, this is one of the fun things about writing a biography, when you get to not only talk to lots of people, but really do a kind of a deep dive into the public record. In this case, it was like 7,000 pages of newspaper, magazine, and academic journals, and hundreds of speeches. And I found this interview that Bill Clinton gave back in 1992 during his own presidential campaign, when he said, 8 years of Hillary Clinton, why not? So it's something that had been very much in their frame for a long time.
Well, don't you think it was especially in their frame, or possibly in their frame, on the night when it was finally decided that George Bush would get the White House and not Al Gore? Wasn't,
sure.
You know, wasn't that the silver lining for them?
Yeah, and as you know, we were talking before about the three forces to be reckoned with in the White House, and the tensions that existed among, well, particularly between Hillary and Al Gore. And that became a real problem when Hillary decided to run for the Senate, and Al Gore was running for the presidency. When it was first indicated back in February 1999 that she was going to run for the Senate, Mario Cuomo, you know, one of the deans of the Democratic Party, said she should really think seriously about what the impact of this will be, because it did in fact turn out to be quite a distraction. She poached fundraisers from Gore, and she was able to use the White House as a platform for her campaign in a fashion that he was denied. And so there were just lots of little ways.
Well, with minus Monica and minus Hillary's Senate run, Al would.
Oh, he would have definitely been president.
Right,
I mean, I think the Monica factor, you cannot ignore. In fact, it's, I think, perhaps the most important thing that happened in the Clinton administration. I was talking to a friend of theirs who'd known them for a very long time, and he said this with a certain amount of anguish, and I'll clean it up a little bit for you, but he said it was the sexual act that changed history.
It was
the most important event of the last 15 years that it had an impact on policy and politics and history. And he said, you know, it's like a very, very bright light that it's very hard to look at. And he said, if there's no question that if Bill Clinton had kept his zipper up north instead of down south, Al Gore would have been elected president, and that is a big deal.